You are a broke nurse who found a rich old man's weakness. I was there when you were not. Comfort made you obedient to wrongdoing.
Compassion used for branding is worse than silence.
They questioned every hour I survived.
I pressed it twice. No one came.
Help me see what they buried.
Then I need the truth, not gratitude. Clear the room now.
They will twist this against you.
Then we let the truth answer.
Every person named in this will has been invited.
You are not carrying this alone.
Let her read it.
Avery Cole sat at the far end of the conference table because the Bancroft family had made sure there was no chair for him near the front. His wife Mara sat beside him, with her shoulders straight and her hand resting over his, as if she could feel the insult in the seating arrangement and refused to let him carry it alone. Across the polished table, her family waited for the reading of Harold Bancroft's will with the kind of grief that had already started calculating. Grant Bancroft, the oldest son, wore a charcoal suit and the tense expression of a man expecting control. Victoria, Mara's sister, dabbed at her eyes only when the attorney looked up. Their mother, Patricia, sat beneath a strand of pearls and stared at Avery as if his presence had lowered the value of the room. For 7 years, they had called him poor. Not always directly. Wealthy people often sharpen cruelty by wrapping it in concern. They said Avery was hard-working but limited, kind but not ambitious, good to Mara perhaps, but not equal to her, when they were tired of pretending they were plainer. They said their daughter had married a black home care nurse with an old car, a rented house, and no family name worth printing on an invitation. They expected Harold's will to prove them right. Then the attorney opened the blue folder, adjusted her glasses, and read the first line that mattered. Harold Bancroft had named Avery Cole as executor of his estate, protector of the family trust, and temporary chairman of Bancroft Haven, the elder care company Grant believed he already controlled. The room turned cold before anyone spoke. Grant laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because his mind rejected the words before his pride could. Patricia whispered that Harold must have been confused. Victoria stared at Avery as if he had stolen something from the table while everyone watched. But the will had only begun. By the time the attorney played Harold's recorded statement, the family was no longer worried about money. They were worried about exposure. Because Harold Bancroft had not left Avery power as a gift, he had left it as evidence. And every sentence revealed what the family had spent years hiding. The poor son-in-law they mocked had been the only one caring for Harold, the only one listening to the staff, and the only one who understood what Bancroft Haven had become after greed learned to speak in the language of care. Avery had never wanted their fortune. He had wanted Mara. He met her in a hospital hallway at 2 a.m, outside the room of an elderly patient who kept asking for a daughter who had not visited. Avery was working as a home care nurse then, picking up overnight shifts to pay off training debt and help his mother with rent. Mara was a social worker assigned to the same patient. She was sitting on a plastic chair with a clipboard on her lap, trying not to cry from exhaustion. Avery noticed the patient's blanket had slipped over, fixed it gently, and asked Mara if she had eaten. It was not flirtation. It was the instinct of someone used to checking what other people forgot. Mara later said that was the first thing that made her look at him twice. He did not enter rooms trying to be impressive. He entered them trying to make someone safer. Their love grew quietly. Coffee after long shifts, Walks in the park when both were too tired for restaurants. Phone calls where Mara admitted her family had money but not much warmth. Avery told her his mother had worked as a nursing assistant for 28 years and had taught him that people reveal their character most clearly around the weak, the sick, and the people paid to clean up after everyone else. When Mara brought him home to meet the Bancrofts, Avery understood within minutes that her family had already chosen the shape of their disappointment. The Bancroft house sat behind iron gates on a hill outside the city with white columns, high windows, and a driveway wide enough for a wedding procession. Inside, everything looked curated. Flowers with no scent, books no one seemed to read, portraits arranged to make inheritance look like virtue. Patricia greeted Avery with a smile that stopped before it reached her eyes. Grant shook his hand too firmly. Victoria asked which medical school he had attended, then looked pleasantly surprised when he explained he was a licensed home care nurse, not a doctor. At dinner, the questions came dressed as conversation. Grant asked whether nursing paid enough to support a family. Patricia asked if Avery had ever considered something more upwardly mobile. Victoria mentioned that Mara had once dated a surgeon, then pretended it was only a memory. Avery answered without shrinking. He spoke about his work, his patients, his mother, his plans to open a small caregiver training program one day. The family heard none of it. They had already reduced him to his paycheck. Only Harold Bancroft watched in silence. Harold was in his 70s then, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and slower than the company photos suggested. He had founded Bancroft Haven after his own mother spent her final year in a facility that looked beautiful in brochures and terrible after visiting hours. He built his company on a promise old people were not inventory and caregivers were not replaceable hands. For decades, the company was known for clean rooms, fair staffing, and residents who were treated like people with histories, not beds with billing codes. But as Harold aged, his children began taking over. Grant spoke of margins. Victoria spoke of brand. Their cousin Ellis, the family attorney, spoke of liability. They did not destroy the company all at once. They polished it while hollowing it out. Staff hours were trimmed, food vendors changed, training budgets shrank, resident activity programs became photo opportunities. The language stayed gentle. The care became thinner. Harold sensed it before he could prove it. He also sensed something in Avery that night at dinner. Not wealth, not polish, attention. When Patricia's elderly aunt spilled water near her plate, everyone else paused as if waiting for staff. Avery stood, fetched a towel, helped her move her chair, and checked whether her sleeve was wet. He did it without making a performance of kindness. Harold noticed. Later, as Avery was leaving, Harold asked him what made a good care facility. Avery did not mention chandeliers, gardens, or brochures. He said a good care facility was one where residents were not afraid to press the call button twice. Harold looked at him for a long moment and said that was the first honest answer he had heard in a year. The Bancrofts hated the marriage before it happened. Patricia told Mara she was confusing compassion with commitment. Grant warned that Avery would become a burden once real life began. Victoria said love was easier when one person did not understand what the other was giving up. Beneath every warning sat the thing they tried not to say too plainly. Avery was black, working class, and outside the circle they believed their daughter belonged to. Mara paid a price for choosing him. Invitations slowed. Family vacations happened without her. Patricia stopped calling except to criticize. Grant made sure she knew certain family accounts would no longer include her. Mara cried over it once, then stopped asking people to love her correctly. Avery offered to walk away before the wedding, not because he wanted to, but because he refused to become the reason Mara lost her entire family by accident. Mara told him she was not losing them by accident. She was learning what their love required her to betray. They married in a small ceremony with more sincerity than money. Harold attended and brought a plain envelope. Inside was not a check, but an old photograph of Bancroft Haven's first facility. On the back he had written, Build only what you are willing to answer for. Avery kept it in a drawer beside his nursing license. Years passed. The family's contempt became almost routine. At birthdays, Grant introduced Avery as the nurse instead of Mara's husband. At dinners, Patricia praised him for being so grounded, using the tone people use when they mean small. Victoria once asked if he felt awkward at charity galas where people discussed large gifts. Avery told her he felt more awkward in rooms where people applauded generosity while underpaying the workers serving dinner. Mara squeezed his hand under the table so tightly it hurt. Harold's health began to fail in the 6th year of their marriage. At first, the family called it normal aging. Then came the falls, the confusion after medication changes, the tremor in his left hand, the fatigue he tried to hide. Grant hired private nurses, then changed agencies twice because he did not like the tone of people who questioned medication instructions. Patricia visited with flowers but rarely stayed through meals. Victoria posted photos with her father online, then left before evening care began. Avery and Mara came after work. Avery did not take over. He respected the nurses. He asked what they needed. He noticed when Harold's pills were being reordered late. He noticed pressure marks on Harold's ankle from a brace left too tight. He noticed Harold ate more when someone sat with him instead of leaving a tray near the bed. He noticed staff whispering in the hallway, exhausted and afraid of being blamed for problems created above them. One night, Harold asked Avery to stay after everyone else had gone. He said Bancroft Haven was sick. Avery did not answer quickly. He had learned that old men with power were often surrounded by people eager to agree with them. Harold did not need agreement. He needed truth. So Avery told him what caregivers were saying. Quietly, staffing ratios were worsening. Supply orders were delayed. Residents were waiting longer for help, and managers were being pressured to keep complaint numbers low. Harold closed his eyes. Then he asked Avery to help him see what his family had hidden. That request changed everything. Avery began visiting Bancroft Haven facilities on his days off, not as an investigator, but as what he already was, a caregiver. He spoke with nurses in break rooms, aides folding linens, kitchen workers, families in waiting areas, residents who still remembered when Harold walked the halls himself. He found patterns: call lights unanswered, meal substitutions that ignored dietary needs, activity budgets billed but not spent, staff schedules edited after inspections, complaint forms marked resolved when families had never received a response. The evidence hurt because it was not abstract. It had names. Mrs. Bellamy, a retired school librarian, waited 40 minutes for help to the bathroom because the night shift was short. Mr. Ortiz missed 2 physical therapy sessions after transportation was cut. A caregiver named Tasha worked double shifts and still had her overtime questioned. A kitchen worker bought soft fruit with her own money because residents with dental problems could not eat the cheaper snacks the new vendor supplied. Avery documented everything carefully. Harold's private attorney, Naomi Sloan, helped preserve records. An outside auditor was hired quietly. Harold's doctors confirmed he was mentally competent during every meeting. The more they found, the clearer it became Grant had been cutting care to inflate profit projections before a planned sale. Victoria had redirected resident programming funds into marketing events. Ellis had buried complaints to avoid regulatory attention. Patricia had looked away because the dividends were comfortable. All the while, they accused Avery of positioning himself. Grant told Mara that her husband was spending too much time with a vulnerable old man. Patricia suggested Avery had always wanted access to the family fortune. Victoria warned that people from different circumstances sometimes saw opportunity where family saw duty. Mara stopped her right there. She said if duty looked like Avery changing Harold's bedding at midnight while they waited for inheritance updates, then the family could use more of it. The final break came at Harold's last birthday dinner. He was too weak for a party, but Patricia insisted on a formal meal at the house because donors, board members, and family friends expected to see him. Harold sat at the head of the table, pale beneath the chandelier. Avery stayed near the side because he had helped with Harold's medication schedule and wanted to make sure he ate. Grant raised a toast to legacy. Victoria spoke about compassion. Patricia described the Bancroft name as a blessing to the elderly. Then Harold began coughing. For several seconds everyone hesitated, not because they did not care at all, but because people trained to perform concern often wait for the proper audience angle. Avery moved first. He steadied Harold, checked his breathing, cleared the room, and spoke calmly to the nurse. The moment passed, but the truth of it remained. When Harold needed help, the poor son-in-law acted. The family watched. Later that night, Harold told Avery he was ready to finish the will. Avery tried to refuse any role involving money. Harold expected that. He said the estate did not need a man hungry for it. It needed a man reluctant enough to respect the weight of it. He was not leaving Avery comfort. He was leaving him responsibility. Mara would be protected separately, so no one could say Avery had used her. The company would be placed under temporary trust control. The audit would become mandatory. Every family inheritance would be conditional on cooperation, restitution, and public correction. Avery said the family would hate him. Harold answered that they already hated the parts of him that could save them. 2 months later, Harold Bancroft died before sunrise, with Mara beside him and Avery holding his hand. Grant arrived after the doctor had left. Patricia asked whether Harold had said anything about the business. Victoria asked when the attorney would call. Mara walked outside and wept on the back steps, not only for her father, but for the family that had kept proving what it valued most. The will reading took place 8 days later. Naomi Sloan. Harold's attorney chose the conference room at the Bancroft estate office instead of the family house. The table was long, the windows tall, the atmosphere brittle. Avery wore a navy suit Mara had pressed that morning. He had not slept much. He expected anger. He did not expect peace. Naomi began with standard language. Dates, names, confirmation of capacity, revocation of previous wills. Grant looked bored until the first major clause named Avery Cole as executor. Then the room shifted. Grant demanded an explanation. Patricia said Harold would never put an outsider over his own blood. Victoria said Mara should be ashamed for allowing this. Mara looked at her sister and said Avery had been in the room because the family kept leaving it. Naomi waited until the interruption ended. Then she read the next provisions. Mara would receive a private inheritance beyond family control. Patricia would retain her residence but lose access to discretionary company funds. Grant, Victoria, and Ellis would receive no distributions until the elder care audit was complete and every diverted dollar was returned. Bancroft Haven would be placed under a temporary stewardship trust chaired by Avery. Staff pension shortages would be corrected before any family inheritance. Residents harmed by reduced care standards would receive restitution. Facilities would be reviewed by independent medical and labor experts. Grant stood so quickly his chair struck the wall. He called it theft. He called it manipulation. He called Avery a broke nurse who had found a rich old man's weakness and climbed through it. Naomi opened a second folder. Harold had anticipated the accusation. There were competency evaluations, video statements, witness signatures, medical records, and months of documented meetings. Then, Naomi played Harold's recorded message. His voice was weaker than the family remembered, but it carried the old authority. He said he had spent his life building a company meant to protect the elderly from being forgotten in beautiful rooms. He said his children had learned to protect the beauty and forget the people. He said Avery, the man they called poor, had noticed more suffering in 6 months than they had noticed in 6 years, because Avery still knew how to measure value without a balance sheet. Patricia began crying then, but not the careful tears she used at public events. These were angry tears, exposed tears. Harold's recording continued. He addressed Grant first. He said leadership without tenderness had turned him into a danger. He addressed Victoria next, saying compassion used for branding was worse than silence. He addressed Patricia and told her comfort had made her obedient to wrongdoing. He addressed Ellis, who was not present but would receive the recording, and said a lawyer who buried complaints from the vulnerable had chosen reputation over justice. Then Harold spoke to Avery. He said Avery had never asked for $1. He had asked whether residents had enough blankets. He had asked why caregivers were afraid to report shortages. He had asked why a man with Harold's wealth should be surrounded by paid helpers while the residents who built ordinary lives were left waiting for basic care. Harold said those questions hurt him more than the illness because they were the questions his own family should have asked. The recording ended with one sentence. If you want to know who is poor, do not look at the man with the smallest bank account. Look at the people who can inherit everything and still have no mercy. No one moved. That sentence became the line the family could never escape. The legal fight began within days. Grant challenged the will. Victoria claimed undue influence. Patricia told friends Avery had isolated Harold in his final months. Ellis filed motions full of polished outrage. For a few weeks, certain people in their social circle believed the Bancrofts. It was easier to imagine a poor black son-in-law scheming than a wealthy family neglecting the elderly while speaking at charity luncheons. Then the documents entered court. Staff schedules, budget cuts, emails, complaint logs, vendor contracts, marketing invoices charged to resident activity funds, messages from Grant about making staffing numbers look inspection ready, notes from Victoria about using residents in promotional videos while canceling the music therapy program, evidence that overtime had been withheld from caregivers who were already working beyond exhaustion. The story broke publicly. Families came forward, former employees spoke, residents' children brought photographs, unanswered emails, and notebooks full of dates when care had failed. The Bancrofts, who had spent years treating Avery as an embarrassment, now watched their own name become attached to the very thing Harold had feared: elegant neglect. Avery did not celebrate. He knew too much about care to confuse exposure with healing. Exposure was only the moment light entered the wound. Healing required cleaning it, and cleaning always hurt. His first act as temporary chairman was not to move into an office. It was to visit every Bancroft Haven facility without cameras. He sat with residents at breakfast. He listened to aides in laundry rooms. He asked nurses what policies wasted time. He asked families what they had been afraid to say. He met Tasha, the caregiver, whose overtime had been questioned, and apologized on behalf of a company that had benefited from her loyalty while doubting her hours. Then he changed the rules. Staffing ratios were restored and made public. Overtime was audited and repaid. Resident funds were separated from marketing budgets. Complaint forms went to an independent review board. Families received direct access to care reports in plain language. Every facility director had to work 3 full shifts, shadowing aides before approving schedules. Executive bonuses were suspended until resident care scores, staff retention, and safety metrics improved together. Grant called it emotional management. Avery called it remembering the business they were actually in. Money moved differently after that. Less went to glossy campaigns, more went to night staffing, training, food quality, equipment therapy programs, and caregiver wages. Investors complained at first. Avery answered with numbers Harold would have respected. Falls decreased, hospital transfers dropped, staff turnover slowed, family complaints became more honest and less desperate. Care improved because the people doing the care were finally treated as part of the mission, not a cost to be hidden. Mara worked beside him, not as decoration, not as the daughter smoothing over family disgrace, but as a social worker who understood residents, families, and grief. She created a family advocacy office, independent from management. She also stopped protecting her relatives from discomfort. When Patricia asked for private access to Avery to settle things quietly, Mara said quiet was how the harm had survived. Grant eventually lost his leadership claim. The court upheld the will. Regulatory fines followed. Ellis was referred for professional review. Victoria resigned from the foundation board after donors demanded accountability. Patricia kept the house, but lost the illusion that her comfort was innocent. Every inheritance remained locked until restitution was complete. Some people called it revenge. Avery rejected that word. Revenge would have been making the Bancrofts feel small simply because they had tried to make him feel small. Justice was different. Justice had residents sleeping safely through the night. Justice had caregivers paid for every hour worked. Justice had families receiving honest answers. Justice had Harold's company returning to the promise that built it. One evening, months after the will reading, Avery found Patricia sitting alone in the garden at the Bancroft house. She looked smaller without an audience. For a long time she said nothing. Then she admitted she had called him poor because it was easier than admitting he possessed something her family had lost. Avery did not rush to comfort her. He had learned that some remorse wants to be rewarded too quickly. He told her poverty had many forms. Some people lacked money. Some lacked courage. Some lacked the ability to see pain unless it threatened their reputation. The first kind was hard. The others were dangerous. Patricia cried quietly. This time Avery believed the tears were real. He also knew real tears did not undo real harm. They were only a beginning. Years later, Bancroft Haven no longer looked like the company Grant had tried to sell. Its brochures were simpler. Its staffing reports were public. Its caregiver training program carried the name of Avery's mother, who had died before seeing her son inherit responsibility from the very world that once looked down on her work. The program trained aides not only in lifting techniques and medication reminders, but in dignity, how to speak to residents who were confused, how to preserve privacy, how to notice loneliness, how to document concerns when supervisors ignored them. Avery kept Harold's photograph in the main office, but not the formal portrait. He chose a picture taken in the last months of Harold's life, sitting in a wheelchair beside Mrs. Bellamy, both of them laughing at something no one else remembered. Under it, Avery placed Harold's final sentence from the recording. Not as a decoration, as a warning. If you want to know who is poor, do not look at the man with the smallest bank account. People still told the story as a shocking inheritance twist. They said the poor black son-in-law got control of everything. They said the family never saw it coming. They said Harold Bancroft exposed them from the grave. But the real story was never that Avery became powerful when the will was read. He had power long before that, the kind power rarely recognizes because it cannot be inherited or purchased. He had the power to enter a sick room without needing applause, the power to listen to workers other people ignored, the power to stay gentle without becoming weak, the power to love Mara without asking her to become smaller for his comfort, the power to be insulted and still remember his purpose. The will did not make Avery worthy. It made the family's blindness impossible to hide. They had called him poor because his car was old, his house was rented, and his hands carried the tiredness of honest work. They had measured him by the things they could count and missed everything that counted most. Harold saw it before the end. Mara had seen it from the beginning, and when the truth finally entered that conference room in the voice of a dying man, the Bancrofts learned that the person they had seated farthest from the inheritance was the only one fit to protect it. Avery never forgot the back of that room. He never forgot Patricia's stare, Grant's laugh, Victoria's disgust, or Mara's hand holding his steady beneath the table. But he also never let that moment become the largest thing in him. The largest thing became the residents, who no longer waited in fear, the caregivers who no longer worked unpaid hours in silence, the families who no longer had to fight polished lies alone, the company that finally remembered care was not a brand. It was a duty performed in small rooms at inconvenient hours by people whose names wealthy families often learned too late. In the end, the Bancrofts were right about one thing. Someone in that family had been poor. It just was not Avery Cole. He had arrived with little money, but he carried patience, loyalty, courage, and a respect for human dignity that no trust fund could create. They had arrived with everything and still found ways to be empty. And when Harold Bancroft's will was finally announced, it did not simply give a poor son-in-law control of a fortune. It revealed that he had been the richest soul in the room all along.
You misrepresented yourself to get this information. I misrepresented my net worth. Tonight, you are going to hear what this really was. Beauty does not make displacement clean. This is not the full context. Then let the full record speak. Every whistleblower will have counsel tonight. The people placed farthest from this stage will decide what happens next.
Now he sounds like home. Do right by the people still wearing those shoes.
You know a lot about financing for a man signed in as unemployed. Being unemployed does not make someone unable to read. Does the relocation fund cover every household? These projects are complex. Some people confuse being left behind with being victimized. Some people confuse standing in front of money with standing on the right side of history. Julian Cross.
Julian Cross walked into the Grand Meridian Ballroom wearing a faded brown jacket, scuffed shoes, and a tie he had bought from a thrift store for $3. At the registration table, the woman with the headset looked at him, then looked past him as if the person she was expecting must be standing behind him. This was not a soup kitchen. This was the public signing ceremony for the East Harbor Renewal Project, a $2 billion redevelopment deal that city officials had been celebrating for months. Cameras waited near the stage. Developers posed beside renderings of glass towers, tree-lined streets, luxury apartments, and smiling families who looked nothing like the families being pushed out. Julian gave his name. The woman checked the list and frowned. Community representative. Her voice made the title sound like a mistake. Before Julian could answer, Addison Vale, the developer leading the project, walked over with a champagne smile and a watch bright enough to catch the chandelier light. Addison looked Julian up and down from the worn cuffs of his jacket to the cracked leather of his shoes. "Mr. Cross," Addison said, barely hiding his amusement, "I admire the courage it takes to show up underdressed to a room like this." A few people nearby laughed softly. One city councilman turned his face away, but not before Julian saw the smile. Addison leaned closer. "Just remember, tonight is about partnership. If you speak, keep it brief. Nobody came here to hear a tenant complain about rent." Julian nodded as if he had received advice instead of an insult. He moved to the back of the room where the community seats had been placed near the service entrance. For 20 minutes he listened as men in tailored suits praised compassion, inclusion, and opportunity. He listened as they spoke about his old neighborhood like it was empty land waiting to be improved. He listened as Addison described poor residents as the heart of the project, even though Addison had spent the last 6 weeks trying to remove them from the building before the first contract was signed. Then the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone and announced that the funding partner had arrived. Addison straightened his jacket. The city officials stood. Everyone expected a gray-haired investor, a private equity chairman, or one of those invisible billionaires who appeared only through lawyers and press releases. Instead, Julian Cross rose from the back row. He walked slowly down the center aisle in the same faded jacket everyone had mocked. Addison's smile began to weaken. The councilman stopped clapping. The woman from registration put one hand over her mouth. Julian stepped onto the stage, removed a folded document from his inside pocket, and placed it beside the contract Addison had been waiting to sign. On the screen behind him, the project logo disappeared. In its place appeared the name of the company funding the entire deal. Cross Meridian Group. Founder and controlling owner, Julian A. Cross. The room went silent. For 6 weeks they had treated him like a broke tenant begging to be heard. They had no idea he owned the billion-dollar corporation whose money they needed. They had no idea he had been listening, recording meetings, reading contracts, and watching how powerful people behaved when they believed the poor man in the room had no power at all. Julian did not smile. He looked at Addison, then at the city officials, then at the cameras. "This project was sold to the public as renewal," he said. "Tonight you are going to hear what it really was." To understand why Julian had hidden who he was, you have to understand where he came from. Julian Cross was born in East Harbor in a brick apartment building with old pipes, thin walls, and a view of the freight tracks. His mother, Lenora Cross, worked in a hospital cafeteria during the day and cleaned offices 3 nights a week. His father had left before Julian was old enough to remember his voice, so Lenora raised him with tired hands, hard rules, and a kind of love that did not have time to be soft every day, but never stopped being loyal. East Harbor was not beautiful in the way brochures use the word. It had corner stores with faded signs, churches with cracked steps, barber shops where old men argued about baseball, and apartment buildings where mothers leaned out windows calling children home before the streetlights came on. It had problems, real ones, but it also had memory. People knew who needed groceries before payday. They knew which grandmother watched children after school. They knew which mechanic would fix a car and let payment wait until Friday. Lenora taught Julian that poverty was not a personality, it was pressure. Some people survived it with grace, some people were crushed by it. Some people escaped it and became ashamed of everyone still standing where they once stood. She told Julian never to become that third kind. He was good with numbers early. Not the kind of good that made teachers say gifted and then forget to help. The kind that made him see patterns in broken systems. He noticed which buildings lost heat first in winter. He noticed the bus schedule changed whenever the waterfront businesses complained, but never when the residents did. He noticed landlords fixed stair rails before inspection and ignored them after. He noticed that poor neighborhoods were studied constantly by people who rarely sat long enough to learn anybody's name. When Julian was 16, East Harbor received its first grand promise. A development company announced a revitalization project called Harbor Rise. There were meetings, posters, smiling officials, and speeches about opportunity. Lenora attended every meeting. She asked where current residents would live during construction. She asked whether rents would stay affordable. She asked whether local workers would get jobs. Men in suits thanked her for her passion and answered nothing clearly. Within 2 years, their building was sold, repairs stopped, notices appeared, rents rose, families scattered. Lenora held on as long as she could. She took extra shifts. Julian worked at a grocery warehouse after school. But pressure does not always arrive as one disaster. Sometimes it arrives as 20 small charges, late fees, rent increases, bus fares, medicine missed hours, and one broken refrigerator the landlord refuses to replace. They lost the apartment in October, just as the weather turned cold. Lenora never recovered from that humiliation. She did not collapse all at once. She kept working. She kept smiling when Julian looked scared. She kept telling him they were only between places. But something inside her quieted. A year later, she died from a heart condition she had ignored because bills had trained her to treat her own body like an expense she could delay. At her funeral, Julian stood beside her coffin and looked at the hands that had kept him alive. He made himself one promise. If he ever built power, he would not let men use beautiful words to steal ordinary people's homes. He left East Harbor with a scholarship, 2 bags, and a grief so disciplined it looked like ambition. He studied engineering, finance, and urban systems. He worked harder than his classmates because he knew talent was not enough when your safety net had already been buried. He built his first company out of a dorm room, creating software that helped cities track infrastructure failures before they became emergencies. Then, he built a second company connecting small contractors to public projects without forcing them through corrupt middlemen. By 40, Julian Cross was one of the richest black founders in America. Cross Meridian Group owned infrastructure platforms, construction technology, clean energy assets, medical, logistics systems, and community development funds across several states. The company was worth more than many cities' annual budgets, yet Julian remained strangely private. His name appeared in business magazines, but his face rarely did. He avoided panels, awards, dinners, and photographs because he had learned that fame attracts people who love the owner more than the mission. He also knew money creates a dangerous silence. The richer he became, the less often people told him the truth. Executives cleaned reports before sending them. Politicians smiled too quickly. Developers discovered words like equity and dignity whenever cross-meridian funds were in the room. Everyone wanted to sound good near capital. So Julian built a habit that made his board uncomfortable. Before funding any project that affected low-income residents, he visited the neighborhood without announcing himself, not in disguise for entertainment, not to play poor like poverty was a costume. He had been poor. He knew there was nothing romantic about choosing between bus fare and dinner. He dressed simply because expensive clothes changed the way people spoke to him. He used his old neighborhood name, Julian Cross, without titles because titles train people to lie upward. Most of the time, he did not need long. A meeting, a bus ride, a conversation outside a grocery store, a visit to a tenants association. People told the truth when they believed the listener had nothing to sell them and nothing to punish them with. East Harbor was different. When the city announced the East Harbor Renewal Project, Julian recognized the streets immediately. The project covered the blocks where his mother had lived, worked, shopped, prayed, and died, exhausted. The proposal came through Vail Urban Partners, Addison Vail's company, with Cross Meridian invited as the anchor funder. On paper, the plan looked almost righteous. Mixed income housing, local hiring, small business grants, green space, a community clinic, public art honoring neighborhood history. Julian wanted to believe it. His board wanted the deal. The projected returns were strong. The city offered tax incentives. Addison had relationships with officials. The renderings were beautiful, and beauty has a way of making displacement look clean. But Julian had learned to distrust documents that spoke warmly about people they never quoted. So he returned to East Harbor. He rented a small room above Mrs. Ada Bell's corner store, under his own name, but without mentioning Cross Meridian. Ada was 74, sharp-eyed, and still able to silence a room with one sentence. She had known Lenora. The first time Julian walked in, she stared at him for a long moment and said he had his mother's sad eyes and his father's height. Then she asked if he had finally come back to remember or to buy. Julian said, maybe both, if remembering did its job. Ada did not ask how much money he had. Old neighborhood people often know success before success introduces itself. But she agreed to keep his secret because she understood why he needed to hear what people said before they knew who held the checkbook. For 6 weeks, Julian became what the project documents called a legacy resident. He attended community meetings in church basements where residents were given 5 minutes to respond to decisions already made. He sat beside mothers trying to understand relocation forms written like traps. He listened to elderly tenants whisper about rent increases they were too embarrassed to admit they could not pay. He met small contractors who had been promised work but asked to sign agreements that made them carry all the risk, while Vail Urban Partners used their names for diversity reports. He visited the old building where he and Lenora had lived. It was half empty, now managed by a shell company connected to Addison's investors. Repairs had slowed. Hallway lights flickered. A broken elevator trapped seniors on upper floors. Notices warned tenants about upcoming inspections, noise, and redevelopment eligibility, but nothing explained where people would go if they failed paperwork deadlines. The neighborhood was being tired out on purpose. That was the first cruelty Julian recognized. Powerful people often do not need to force poor families out. They can confuse them out, delay them out, price them out, exhaust them out, then call the empty building proof that nobody wanted to stay. Addison Vail entered the story like a man already applauding himself. He was 46, polished, handsome, and practiced in civic language. He used words like transformation, healing, access, and partnership. He kept framed photos in his office of himself shaking hands with pastors, teachers, and children in neighborhoods he later changed beyond recognition. He knew how to perform listening. He tilted his head at residents. He took notes. He thanked people for sharing lived experience. Then he returned to private meetings and called those same people obstacles. Julian first met him at a community feedback session inside Mount Zion Baptist Church. Addison arrived late with 2 assistants and a photographer. He apologized for the delay, then spoke for 20 minutes about a project he claimed belonged to the people. When residents asked direct questions, he answered with fog. How many apartments would stay affordable after 5 years? The team was exploring sustainable affordability. Would current tenants have a guaranteed right to return? The goal was to minimize disruption. Would local contractors receive real contracts or only subcontract scraps? Vail Urban Partners was committed to inclusive participation. Julian stood near the back and raised his hand. Addison glanced at him, saw the worn jacket, and looked mildly annoyed. Julian asked whether the relocation fund had enough money to cover deposits, moving costs, storage, temporary rent, school transportation, and legal help for every household affected. The room became still because the question was too specific to dismiss easily. Addison smiled. That's a very passionate concern. Our team has studied best practices. Julian asked again whether the fund had enough money. Addison's smile thinned. Sir, these projects are complex. We cannot build the future if every number is treated as a weapon. Adabel spoke from the front row. Numbers become weapons when people aim them at our rent. The room murmured. Addison laughed lightly, the way men laugh when they want to make a challenge look rude. After the meeting, he approached Julian. I understand frustration, Addison said, but if you want to be useful, don't stir people up with technical questions you may not fully understand. Julian looked at him calmly. Maybe explain it better. Addison studied him. Then, seeing not a man but a category, poor black resident, possibly angry, possibly educated enough to be inconvenient, not powerful. There's a community stipend for advisory participation, Addison said. People who help us keep meetings constructive can receive modest compensation. It was a bribe dressed as outreach. Julian asked, how modest? Addison said $500 a month. Julian thought of Lenora counting coins on their old kitchen table of mothers in the room who could use $500, of how easily hunger can be turned into silence by people who call it cooperation. He told Addison he would think about it. That night, Julian sent the offer to his compliance team. The evidence began gathering quickly after that. Addison's public promises did not match private budgets. The affordable units were scheduled to convert to market rate after a short compliance window. The local hiring fund was smaller than the launch event budget. The relocation plan excluded undocumented families, informal tenant seniors without digital access, and anyone who missed a deadline buried in legal language. The small business grant program required applicants to waive future claims against the developer. Most painful of all, Julian discovered the building where he and Lenora had lived was marked for early demolition. The developer's internal report described it as low-resistance inventory. Low resistance. That was what they called people who were old, tired, poor, sick, undocumented, overworked, or too confused to fight. It was the cleanest, cruel phrase Julian had seen in years. He printed the report and carried it in his jacket for 3 days. During those weeks, he met people who made the project more than a file. There was Marisol Vega, a single mother who ran a daycare from her apartment and had already lost 3 families because parents feared moving. There was Mr. Harlan Price, a retired bus driver who could not use the stairs when the elevator failed but was too proud to ask neighbors to carry groceries. There was Tanya Brooks, a black woman who owned a small electrical contracting company and had been promised a role on the project, then given a contract so thin she would lose money if anything went wrong. There was Jamal, a 16-year-old who filmed broken hallway lights, and city inspectors who came only after tenants complained publicly. Julian did not reveal himself to them. That was the hardest part. More than once he wanted to write checks, hire lawyers, fix every elevator, pay every rent increase. Sometimes he did help, quietly, through Ada's church fund, but he forced himself not to turn the story into private rescue. Private rescue could save a few people while leaving the machine intact. He needed to stop the machine. The antagonism sharpened as the signing date approached. Addison's team began treating Julian as a problem. At meetings, they skipped his questions. A city staffer told him he had exceeded his share of community input. Someone posted online that outside agitators were trying to block progress for families who needed jobs. Julian almost laughed when he read it. He had been born 2 blocks from the project site, but because he asked the wrong questions, they made him foreign to his own home. Then came the contractor breakfast. Vale Urban Partners invited local businesses to a hotel conference room to discuss opportunities. Julian attended with Tanya Brooks, who asked him to come because she wanted a witness. Addison's procurement director explained the project's commitment to diversity while distributing contract terms that shifted insurance delays, penalties, and material risks onto small subcontractors. Tanya asked whether payment would be guaranteed within 30 days. The director said they were building partnerships, not handouts. Julian asked whether Vale expected small contractors to finance a billion-dollar project with their credit cards. The room went quiet. A man near the coffee urn whispered that somebody needed to get Julian a job before he ruined opportunities for everyone else. Addison, who had just entered the room, heard enough to smile. "Mr. Cross," he said, "you seem to know quite a lot about financing for a man who signed in as unemployed." There it was. Not only contempt, but the pleasure of saying it publicly. A few people laughed. Tanya did not. Ada, who had come representing the Store Owners Association, folded her arms. Julian answered, "Being unemployed doesn't make someone unable to read." Addison stepped closer. "No, but bitterness can make people confuse reading with understanding." Julian felt the old heat rise in him, the kind that had lived in his chest when landlords spoke down to Lenora. He held it. Anger had carried him far, but discipline had carried him farther. He asked Addison one final question in that room. If the project was truly for East Harbor, why did the contract allow Vale to replace local contractors after using their names in the funding application? Addison's face changed for less than a second. Then he said the breakfast was over. The midpoint came from someone Julian did not expect. A junior analyst from Vale Urban Partners named Billionaire contacted him through the email he had been using as a resident advocate. She did not know he was the funder. She only knew he asked the right questions and seemed stubborn enough to survive the answers. They met at a public library near the old train station. Priya was young, frightened, and carrying a folder that made her hands shake. She had joined Vale because she believed in urban renewal. Then she saw 2 sets of numbers, one for public presentations, another for investor returns. She saw internal messages about targeting buildings with elderly tenants because turnover would be easier. She saw references to political contributions, inspection timing, and a phrase that kept appearing in emails, narrative management. She gave Julian copies of everything. He asked why she trusted him. Priya said she did not trust him exactly. She trusted the fact that he had nothing to gain. Julian almost told her then. Instead, he thanked her and promised the documents would reach people who could use them. That night, he went to the waterfront alone. East Harbor had changed. Some warehouses were restaurants now. Some blocks were fenced off. Murals had appeared where eviction notices once hung. Julian stood near the place where his mother used to wait for the bus, after cleaning offices, her shoes in one hand on summer nights because her feet hurt too badly to keep wearing them. He remembered being small and angry because the world made her tired and then judged her for looking tired. He wondered what she would think of him now, a man rich enough to move markets standing in cheap shoes by choice. Then he knew the answer. Lenora would not care about the shoes. She would ask whether he was doing right by the people still wearing them because they had no choice. The final public meeting before the signing was held in the city council chamber. By then, Vail Urban Partners had filled the room with supporters, paid consultants, union representatives promised jobs, and nonprofit leaders promised grants. Residents who opposed the project were given speaking slots near the end, when reporters often left. Julian waited 3 hours to speak. When his name was called, Addison leaned toward a council aide and murmured something. The microphone at the public podium failed as Julian began. People chuckled. Someone offered to move on. Julian waited until the technician fixed it. Then he spoke for exactly 2 minutes. He did not reveal himself. He did not accuse without evidence. He asked the council to postpone the signing until the relocation fund affordability terms, contractor protections, and tenant return guarantees were made legally enforceable. He said East Harbor did not oppose renewal. It opposed being erased and thanked for its cooperation afterward. A councilman named Derek Holt interrupted him. Holt had taken campaign donations from people tied to the project, though that was not public yet. He said emotion could not be allowed to derail progress. Then he looked at Julian and said, "Some people confuse being left behind with being victimized." The sentence landed like a slap. Julian looked at him for a long moment. "Councilman," he said, "some people confuse standing in front of money with standing on the right side of history." The room erupted. Holt ordered the microphone cut. Addison's team moved quickly afterward, telling reporters that a small group of activists was spreading misinformation. The signing gala remained scheduled for Friday. That was when Julian decided the reveal would happen in public. His board argued against it. His lawyers wanted a quieter termination of the funding agreement. His communications team warned that appearing to have deceived the community could backfire. Julian listened to all of them, then said the deception had not begun with his jacket. It had begun with renderings that showed families who would never be able to afford the finished buildings. The public deserved the truth in the same room where the lie was going to be celebrated. On Friday evening, the Grand Meridian Ballroom glittered. There were white tablecloths, gold programs, flower arrangements, a string quartet, and a scale model of the future East Harbor under glass. The model showed towers, parks, cafes, bike lanes, and tiny plastic people walking through a neighborhood without a single moving truck, eviction notice, or frightened grandmother. Addison moved through the room like a man accepting praise in advance. Councilman Holt shook hands near the stage. Grant Ellery, the city's economic development director, told reporters this was a model for inclusive growth. Vail's investors stood beside the renderings, speaking about unlocking value. Julian arrived alone. The registration insult happened first, then Addison's warning, then the laughter. Julian took his seat in the back and watched the performance unfold. One speaker after another praised the partnership with Cross Meridian Group. They spoke of Julian Cross as if he were a distant force of capital, not the man sitting near the service entrance. Addison called him a visionary investor committed to dignity, though Addison had never met him. Holt said East Harbor residents would one day thank the city for making hard decisions. Grant Ellery said progress required trust. Julian almost stood at that word, trust. The ceremony reached the signing moment. Addison stepped to the table. The mayor lifted the pen. Cameras leaned forward. The host announced that Cross Meridian's final representative had arrived to authorize funding and offer remarks. Julian rose. At first, people only seemed annoyed that someone from the back was blocking the aisle. Then he kept walking. Addison's eyes narrowed. Holt frowned. The host looked toward security. Julian climbed the steps to the stage. "Sir," the host whispered, "this area is restricted." Julian looked at him. "I know." Then Naomi Reed, Cross Meridian's general counsel, entered from the side door with 2 board members, 3 auditors, and a stack of binders. She walked to the microphone and spoke clearly. Good evening. I am Naomi Reed, General Counsel for Cross Meridian Group. Please welcome our founder and controlling owner, Julian A. Cross. For a moment, nobody reacted. The truth was too large to fit the image they had built of him. Then the screen changed. Julian's company profile appeared, not the magazine version, not the polished portrait, but the legal certification tying him to the funding entity behind the project. Cross Meridian Group. Meridian Civic Fund. East Harbor Renewal Anchor Capital. Final Approval Authority, Julian A. Cross. Addison took one step back. Julian placed his worn folder on the podium. He did not change his jacket. He did not straighten his tie. He wanted every camera to capture the man they had dismissed as poor, standing in the clothes that had told them permission to be cruel. He began with his mother. He said Lenora Cross had lived 2 blocks from the ballroom's projected development zone. She had worked, paid rent, raised a son, and died after a previous renewal project taught her that progress often comes with a moving truck for the people who made a neighborhood worth wanting. He said Cross Meridian was prepared to fund East Harbor because he believed development could repair harm instead of repeating it. Then he said Vail Urban Partners had failed the test. Addison tried to interrupt. Naomi stepped forward and reminded him that the funding agreement gave Cross Meridian authority to suspend execution pending compliance violations. Julian showed the first slide. It was Addison's stipend offer to community participants, classified internally as opposition management. Then came the private affordability schedule, showing units converting to market rate. Then the local contractor waiver. Then the relocation exclusions. Then Priya's documents showing 2 sets of numbers. Then emails describing elderly tenants as low-resistance inventory. Then messages between Vail consultants and city staff discussing inspection timing and narrative management. The ballroom lost its glitter piece by piece. People stopped holding champagne glasses casually. Reporters began typing. Councilman Holt stared at the floor. Addison's investors whispered urgently to one another. Addison himself had gone pale beneath the stage lights, though anger fought hard to return color to his face. He said the documents were preliminary. He said all major projects involved rough language before final terms. He said Julian had misrepresented himself to obtain information. Julian answered calmly. I misrepresented my net worth. You represented exploitation as community partnership. We can let the public decide which one matters more. That line traveled farther than the ballroom. But Julian was not there only to humiliate. Humiliation was too small for what East Harbor needed. He announced that Cross Meridian was terminating Vail Urban Partners' development role for cause. The city funding agreement would be frozen pending review. Cross Meridian would refer evidence to state investigators, including potential procurement misconduct and improper coordination with public officials. Priya and any other whistleblowers would receive legal protection through Cross Meridian's Ethics Fund. Then he turned toward the residents seated in the back, the people Vail had placed farthest from the stage. He announced the East Harbor Community Ownership Trust. Every resident in the affected zone would receive legal counsel before relocation decisions. No building could be demolished until every household had a guaranteed right to return or an accepted alternative with full moving costs, deposit support, storage, transportation assistance, and rent stabilization. Affordable units would be permanent, not temporary. Local contractors would receive direct contracts with payment protections. A percentage of project profits would flow into a resident-controlled fund for schools, repairs, small businesses, and elder support. The old hospital cafeteria where Lenora worked would become a workforce training center named in her honor. For the first time that night, applause came from the back of the room. Not the polite applause of donors. Not the performance applause of people watching power congratulate itself. This applause carried relief, anger, disbelief, and the sound of people realizing they had not been crazy for suspecting the beautiful plan had teeth. Ada Bell stood first, then Marisol, then Tanya, then Mr. Price leaning heavily on his cane. Soon half the ballroom was standing, while the front tables sat stunned. Addison left before the cameras could surround him. Holt tried to leave through a side exit and found reporters waiting there too. Grant Ellery released a statement by midnight saying the city welcomed transparency, which fooled almost no one. Vail Urban Partners investors suspended their participation within 24 hours. Priya's documents triggered a formal investigation. Within a month, Addison resigned. Within 3 councilmen, Holt was facing ethics charges. Several shell companies tied to tenant harassment were exposed and fined. But Julian knew consequences on paper were only the beginning. The neighborhood still had broken elevators. People still feared rent. Contractors still needed work. Trust once damaged does not return because a billionaire gives a speech. It returns when promises survive inconvenience. So Julian moved Cross Meridian's project office into East Harbor, not downtown. The first office opened in an old bank branch with cloudy windows and a vault no one used. Residents could walk in without appointments. Forms were rewritten in plain language. Translators were hired. Tenant lawyers sat at folding tables 3 days a week. Contractors met with procurement officers who had authority to approve real work, not just collect names for reports. Julian attended the first meeting without cameras. Some residents were angry with him. They said he should have revealed himself sooner. They said he had watched them suffer while holding power. They were not entirely wrong, and Julian did not defend himself too quickly. He explained why he had needed evidence, but he also admitted that strategy could feel like abandonment to people living the pressure in real time. He apologized without asking the apology to end the conversation. That mattered. Marisol asked whether the daycare families would be protected. They were. Mr. Price asked whether the elevator would be fixed before any groundbreaking ceremony. It was repaired the next week. Tanya asked whether small contractors would be paid fast enough to make payroll. Cross Meridian created a payment guarantee. Ada asked who would control the community fund after the headlines faded. Julian said residents would elect the board and Cross Meridian would not hold a majority. Ada looked at him for a long moment. Your mother would have asked that first, Julian smiled sadly. I know. The project changed shape. It became slower, less glamorous, and more honest. Some investors left. Julian let them. He said anyone who needed displacement to make a project profitable did not understand the kind of wealth Cross Meridian intended to build. The new plans preserved more existing buildings. Repairs began before luxury construction. The community clinic opened in a renovated grocery warehouse instead of being promised for Phase 3. The Lenora Cross Training Center taught electrical work, building maintenance project management, coding for construction systems, and tenant law basics. Young people from East Harbor worked on the project instead of watching outsiders build over their childhood streets. Not everything became perfect. Some families still chose to move. Some arguments over design lasted for months. Some city agencies resisted losing control. Some residents never fully trusted Julian, and he accepted that. Trust was not owed to him because he had money or because he had exposed Addison. Trust had to be earned the slow way through kept promises. 1 year after the ballroom reveal, Julian stood inside the lobby of the building where he and Lenora had once lived. The walls had been repaired. The elevator worked. The old mailboxes had been restored instead of replaced because residents said the brass doors reminded them of who had lived there before. On the ground floor, a room that once held broken furniture had become a tenant's office and after-school space. Ada walked in carrying a box of donated books and found Julian standing near the stairs. She asked if he was admiring his empire. He shook his head. I was remembering how small I felt here. Ada set the box down. Small isn't always the same as powerless. Sometimes it just means the room was built wrong. Julian carried that sentence with him. The story spread nationally, of course. Reporters loved the idea of a black billionaire pretending to be poor and exposing developers who mocked him. Talk shows wanted the simple version. Social media wanted the satisfying clip, Addison's face when Julian took the stage. Business magazines wanted to call it undercover leadership. Some critics said Julian had manipulated everyone. Some praised him as a hero. Neither version was fully true. Julian refused most interviews. When he finally spoke publicly, he chose a local radio station in East Harbor. No dramatic music, no skyline backdrop, just a small studio, a tired microphone, and a host who had known his mother. He said he did not pretend poverty was easy. He had lived enough of it to know better. He said wearing old shoes by choice for 6 weeks could never equal the fear of wearing them because there was no money for another pair. The point was not to imitate struggle. The point was to remove the armor wealth gives a person and see how the system treats someone without it. Then he said the most important sentence of the interview. The real disguise was never my jacket. It was their compassion. That became the line people remembered, because Addison had worn compassion beautifully. So had the city officials, so had the investors who spoke about inclusion while planning exclusion. Their suits, speeches, renderings, and community breakfasts had been costumes. Julian's cheap jacket revealed who they were. Their expensive language hid it. Years later, East Harbor looked different, but not erased. There were new buildings, yes, but also old ones repaired with care. Murals honored residents by name, not abstract struggle. The training center graduated its first class of apprentices, many hired directly into the project. Tanya Brooks expanded her electrical company and mentored smaller contractors so they would never sign the kind of trap Vail had offered her. Marisol's daycare moved into a larger space with subsidized rent. Mr. Price sat on the Community Trust Board and became famous for reading every line of every budget. Julian remained involved, but he did not let the project become a monument to himself. The first rule of the Community Trust prohibited naming buildings after living donors. Ada insisted on that. Julian agreed before she finished the sentence. The only name he allowed was Lenora's. On the day the Lenora Cross Training Center opened, Julian stood at the back of the room while residents filled the seats near the stage. He wore a simple dark suit, this time not the faded jacket, not the billionaire uniform either, something in between, something that felt like him. A photograph of Lenora sat near the entrance. In it, she was younger than Julian had been when he returned wearing her cafeteria uniform and laughing at something outside the frame. He had chosen that photo because she looked alive in it, not noble, not tragic, not useful for a speech, just alive. Ada spoke first, then Tanya, then a young apprentice named Jamal who had once filmed broken hallway lights and now planned to become an electrical engineer. Julian spoke last. He did not talk long. He said his mother had cleaned rooms where people made decisions about neighborhoods like hers. She had served food to doctors, executives, and donors who might never have known her name. She had worked hard enough to deserve rest and lived in a system that turned her exhaustion into someone else's opportunity. The center could not bring her back. It could only refuse to waste what her life had taught him. He looked at the young people in the room. Then he said wealth was not proof that someone had escaped poverty correctly. Sometimes wealth was only a test of whether a person remembered who got tired so they could rise. The room stayed quiet after that. The good kind of quiet. The kind that means people are not waiting for the next line because the last one has already found them. Later that evening, Julian walked alone through East Harbor. Children played near the renovated courtyard. Older residents sat outside in folding chairs. A bus sighed at the corner. The city lights reflected in puddles after a short rain. He stopped in front of Ada's store, where a new sign hung beside the old one, Community Trust Office upstairs. Ada came out with 2 paper cups of coffee and handed him one. She asked if he was done pretending. Julian looked down at his shoes. They were better now, but still plain. I don't think I was pretending to be poor, he said. I think I was trying to remember what money makes other people forget. Ada nodded. That's harder. It was harder. It would always be harder. The people who mocked Julian in that ballroom had thought poverty meant ignorance. They thought a man in cheap clothes could be managed with a stipend, silenced with embarrassment, and dismissed with technical language. They had mistaken worn fabric for weakness. They had mistaken humility for lack of status. They had mistaken a resident's question for a poor man's complaint, never imagining it was the final audit of their character. When the truth came out, their downfall felt sudden, but it had been building every time they chose extraction and called it renewal, every time they saw a grandmother as a relocation cost, every time they used a black contractor's name for a diversity report while writing terms that could bankrupt her, every time they described a neighborhood as empty because the people living there did not matter to the financial model. Julian's reveal did not create their guilt, it only made their guilt visible to people with cameras. And Julian's power did not begin when the screen displayed his company name. It began years earlier in a small apartment where Lenora Cross taught her son that being looked down on should never teach him to look down on others. It began when he chose memory over shame. It began when he understood that the point of owning tables was not to sit above people, but to stop decisions from being made without them. That is why East Harbor remembered the story differently from the rest of the world. The world remembered the poor black man who turned out to be a billionaire. East Harbor remembered the son who came home, listened before speaking, and used the money behind the deal to change who the deal belonged to. And somewhere in the city, long after the headlines faded, Addison Vale's old renderings still existed in a file showing a perfect neighborhood without the people who made it real. Julian kept one copy in his office, not as a trophy, but as a warning. Beauty without justice can be another form of demolition. Beside it, he kept a photograph of the old apartment stairwell after the repairs, the same stairs he had climbed as a boy. The same building the developers had called low-resistance inventory. In the new photograph, the walls were painted, the lights worked, and Mr. Price was sitting on the landing with 2 children, showing him a school project. That was what victory looked like to Julian. Not revenge, not applause, not Addison's face in the ballroom, a hallway where people could stay, a neighborhood where progress did not require disappearance. A promise to his mother kept in brick paper policy and names on a trust document. So if anyone tells the story as if Julian Cross fooled the rich by pretending to be poor, they are missing the deeper truth. He did not need to fool them. They revealed themselves the moment they believed he was nobody. All he did was give them a chance to treat a poor black man with dignity. They failed. And then they learned he owned the company powerful enough to make that failure cost them everything.